You watch a father lead his daughter through marble corridors, her hand trembling in his. She's 14. He's a senator who once commanded legions. But tonight, he's not leading her to safety. He's delivering her to a golden chamber where the emperor waits, where scribes with wax tablets sit ready to record every detail, where the price of refusal was demonstrated 3 days ago when another senator's son was returned to him, castrated, and left on the Senate steps. The father's face is stone. The daughter's eyes are empty. This is Rome. This is governance. This is what happens when one man transforms sexual violence into state policy, complete with fees, schedules, and official documentation filed alongside tax records and military expenditures. Before we descend further into this machinery of horror, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me that a story this dark from 2,000 years ago still grips people across every continent. Rome, 37 CE. The young emperor who would orchestrate this system ascended to power on a wave of celebration so euphoric that the entire city shut down for 3 months of continuous festivals. Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus called Caligula for the miniature soldier's boots he wore as a child, was 24 years old, charismatic, educated, and beloved. He was the son of Germanicus, Rome's most popular general, and the great-grandson of Augustus himself. When he took the throne, people wept with joy. The Senate, exhausted by the paranoid tyranny of Emperor Tiberius, finally relaxed. Women scattered flower petals in Caligula's path. Children sang songs about the golden age returning. Nobody imagined that within 4 years, those same senators would be forced to sign legal documents consenting to the systematic abuse of their own wives and daughters, or that those same marble halls would echo with bureaucratic discussions about fertility assessments and breeding schedules. The question that haunts historians isn't simply how Caligula became a monster, it's how he convinced an entire empire to become his accomplice. The first 8 months were genuinely promising. Caligula reduced taxes, freed political prisoners Tiberius had locked away for years, staged spectacular gladiatorial games, repaired aqueducts, and distributed bonuses to soldiers. He walked openly among crowds, dined with senators, and seemed to genuinely enjoy governing. Ancient sources describe him as witty, generous, and unusually accessible for someone of imperial rank. Then, in October of 37 CE, he fell violently ill. Court physicians documented fevers so intense they feared his brain would cook inside his skull. He suffered seizures that required 6 men to restrain him. For days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes screaming that Jupiter was speaking directly into his mind, sometimes lying so still they checked repeatedly to see if he was still breathing. Rome held its breath. Citizens made desperate vows to the gods, some even pledged their own lives if it would save the emperor. When Caligula finally recovered, something fundamental had changed. His eyes, witnesses noted, looked different, wider, emptier, as if something behind them had been burned away. The transformation wasn't immediate, it was methodical. First came the religious proclamations. Caligula ordered that the heads of all major statues of gods throughout Rome be replaced with sculptures of his own face. He began referring to himself not as emperor, but as Jupiter incarnate. He built a temple where he installed a life-sized golden statue of himself and hired priests to conduct daily rituals before it, complete with sacrifices of flamingos, peacocks, and other exotic birds. Senators were invited to contribute enormous sums to maintain this cult. Those who hesitated found themselves summoned for private audiences they rarely survived intact. But the religious grandiosity was just the framework. What came next was far more calculated, far more intimate, and far more devastating to Rome's social fabric. It began with his sisters. Caligula had 3: Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Julia Livilla. Ancient historians, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, document that Caligula's relationship with Drusilla crossed every boundary Roman society held sacred. He seated her in positions of honor reserved for empresses at public ceremonies. He swore oaths by her name in official documents. When she died suddenly in 38 CE, possibly from fever. Though some whispered about poison Caligula's grief manifested as tyranny. He declared it a capital crime to laugh, bathe, or dine with family during the mourning period. Several people were executed simply for appearing insufficiently devastated. But his obsession didn't end with her death. It metastasized. His remaining sisters, and then the wives and daughters of Rome's elite, became the targets of what would evolve into a state apparatus of sexual violence so organized it had its own administrative structure. The system emerged gradually, which made it more insidious. It started with invitations to palace banquets where noblewomen were expected to attend without their husbands. These gatherings began as seemingly normal social functions, but slowly transformed into something else. Caligula would seat himself on a raised golden throne and conduct what he called evaluations. Women were made to parade before him while he offered running commentary on their physical attributes, loud enough for everyone to hear, detailed enough to humiliate. He took notes on small wax tablets that were later transcribed into official records. A senator's wife was adequate for breeding but lacking enthusiasm. A patrician daughter was virginal in appearance, likely valuable for specialized service. These weren't just cruel observations, they were classifications. They were the beginning of a catalog. The first documented forced transaction occurred in early 39 CE. Lucius Vitellius, a senator of considerable standing, was informed that his wife, Sextilia, had been selected for sacred service to the imperial divinity. The language was deliberately religious, cloaking sexual violence in the terminology of temple ritual. Vitellius was presented with a contract, an actual legal document that outlined the terms. His wife would spend 3 nights per month in the palace, participating in ceremonies that were never explicitly defined but were implicitly understood. The contract included a fee structure. Vitellius would pay 20,000 sesterces annually for this honor. Refusal wasn't presented as an option. But the consequences were made clear through an attached list of senators who had recently lost property, positions, or family members due to acts against the state. Vitellius signed. The precedent was set. Within months, the system expanded exponentially. Caligula established what he called the imperial sacred service, a bureaucratic apparatus that processed requests, maintained schedules, and collected fees with the efficiency of any Roman administrative body. There were clerks who maintained registries of eligible women, sorted by age, marital status, and family wealth. There were schedulers who coordinated timing to avoid conflicts and ensure maximum participation. There were physicians, respectable doctors from prominent families who conducted mandatory examinations, assessing fertility and physical suitability. One surviving fragment of a medical text discovered in a sealed chamber beneath what was once part of the imperial palace describes these examinations in clinical detail. Women were inspected like livestock. Their menstrual cycles were tracked. Their physical responses were documented. All of this was recorded in neat Latin on papyrus and filed in archives alongside grain inventories and military deployment orders. The palace itself was redesigned to accommodate this new function. Entire wings were converted into what Caligula insisted be called temples. Each room had a specific designation. The Chamber of Jupiter, where the emperor himself presided over rituals. The Hall of Venus, decorated with frescoes depicting mythological scenes of divine unions imagery that served to normalize what was happening by draping it in religious and artistic legitimacy. The Room of Priapus, named after the god of fertility, where acts specifically designed to humiliate and break the spirit were conducted with methodical precision. The marble floors, which had once echoed with debates about military strategy and legal reform, now carried very different sounds. The women drafted into this system were categorized into tiers. First were the wives of senators, mature women from established families who provided political leverage. Their participation ensured their husbands' compliance on votes and policy matters. Second were the daughters' girls as young as 12 or 13, selected based on family lineage and physical appearance. These were framed as apprenticeships in sacred service, with the grotesque implication that they were being educated in divine mysteries. Third were women designated for what internal documents called the breeding program, a eugenics initiative, where fertile women were compelled to bear children whose paternity was officially attributed to the emperor. These children were taken from their mothers at birth and raised in imperial households, their origins carefully documented but publicly obscured. The breeding program represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Caligula's system because it reveals long-term intentionality. This wasn't impulsive sadism, was generational planning. Secretarial records describe detailed genetic tracking, noting which family lines produced the healthiest children, which women recovered most quickly from childbirth, which infants showed desired physical characteristics. Some historians argue this was Caligula's attempt to literally breed anew. Roman aristocracy, loyal only to him children, raised from infancy to view the emperor as a divine father figure, untethered from traditional family structures and therefore immune to the old republican values that might inspire resistance. Men, too, were not exempt. The sons of patrician families, particularly those between ages 14 and 20, were subjected to what palace documents termed aesthetic education. They were dressed in translucent, saffron-colored tunics, their faces painted with white lead and red ochre in imitation of feminine cosmetics. They were taught to move with exaggerated grace, to speak in softer tones, to perform dances at banquets that left nothing to interpretation. These young men were then offered in what can only be described as auctions not for money, but for political favor. A senator who wanted a particular legislation passed might be granted a night with one of these youths. A general seeking command of a legion might earn it through participation in the evening's entertainment. The humiliation wasn't merely in the act itself, but in the transaction, in watching Rome's elite bid for access to each other's children while Caligula presided like a master of ceremonies, using his gilded staff to point out selections and orchestrate pairings. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was how Caligula forced families to become complicit in their own destruction. Parents weren't just witnesses, they were participants. Fathers were required to escort their daughters to the palace personally, to sign consent documents, to appear at ceremonies where they stood as formal witnesses to what was called sacred union. Some were even made to hold torches during nighttime rituals, literally illuminating the abuse of their own children. Mothers were compelled to prepare their daughters, bathing them, dressing them in the required ceremonial garments, speaking scripted words of blessing that they choked on while speaking. This forced complicity was perhaps Caligula's most ingenious cruelty. It wasn't enough to destroy families, he made them destroy themselves, ensuring that the shame and guilt would be internalized. That resistance would be psychologically impossible because to resist would be to admit what they had already participated in. The Senate, that august body that had once held emperors accountable, became an active collaborator. In 39 CE, a series of laws were passed that provided legal framework for the entire system. One statute declared the emperor's body sacred, making any union with him a religious act rather than a civil one effectively, placing these encounters outside normal legal jurisdiction. Another law established that any child born from imperial union, regardless of the mother's marital status, held rank superior to children born in traditional marriage, meaning a senator's legitimate heirs could be displaced by children born from forced encounters in the palace. These weren't secret decrees hidden in archives. They were publicly debated, publicly voted on, and passed with overwhelming majorities. The senators understood perfectly what they were endorsing. They voted anyway, because by that point, the cost of refusal had been made abundantly clear. Senator Cornelius Sinus' refusal to send his wife for imperial service cost him dearly. Publicly invoking Roman values, he defied the emperor. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was found alive but surgically castrated, with the price of tradition carved into his chest. Terrified, Cinna recanted that afternoon and escorted Livia to the palace. When she bore a son, Cinna was forced to recognize him as heir, displacing his other children. The system didn't merely punish resistance, it weaponized it, turning victims and their families into living examples to enforce obedience and ensure that defiance carried unthinkable personal cost. The administrative machinery required to maintain this system was staggering in its scope. Beneath the Palatine Hill, in sealed chambers that wouldn't be excavated until modern times, archaeologists have found remnants of what can only be described as an archive of atrocity. Thousands of fragmented documents, many deliberately burned but some surviving in partial form, reveal the bureaucratic underpinning. Each victim had a file that included name, age, family connections, physical description, schedule of participation, medical examinations, results. Any resulting pregnancies, documented injuries, fees paid, and guards assigned. The fees themselves varied according to a complex formula. Senators paid more than knights. Virgins commanded higher rates than married women. Daughters of consular families cost more than daughters of provincial governors. These weren't payments to the women, they were contributions to the imperial treasury, recorded as voluntary donations for sacred purposes in official financial records. Hundreds of people were employed in maintaining this apparatus. There were the schedulers who coordinated logistics, ensuring no conflicts and maximum efficiency. There were guards who escorted women to and from the palace, following prescribed routes at prescribed times. There were physicians who conducted quarterly health assessments. There were midwives who attended forced births, separating infants from mothers before maternal bonds could form. There were scribes who recorded everything in triplicate, one copy for the central archive, one for the emperor's personal records, one for the family involved as both receipt and reminder. There were accountants who tracked revenue, managed budgets for ceremonial garments and furnishings, and calculated the financial productivity of the entire operation. The dispersion of responsibility across so many individuals made moral accountability nearly impossible. Each person could claim they were simply performing their assigned function, just another cog in the machine, unaware of or uninvolved in the broader purpose. Roman ceremonial dates became ritualized stages for systematic abuse. Full moons hosted lunar fertility rites. Spring equinoxes were repurposed into myth-inspired spectacles, all meticulously planned with rehearsals, costumes, and invitations. A shadow economy thrived. Merchants, physicians, and tutors profited by supporting and concealing the abuses. Victims endured psychological devastation. Some fell mute, others dissociated, narrating trivialities while trauma went unacknowledged. Suicide attempts were thwarted, self-harm punished, and even disfigurement failed to grant reprieve. Every participant, from officials to suppliers, knew their role. Caligula's system left no escape. Survival required complicity, and even death demanded imperial permission, normalizing cruelty as state function. Those who attempted to flee Rome entirely were tracked by a network of informants that Caligula inherited from Tiberius and expanded significantly. The frumentory military scouts, officially tasked with grain supply, so functioned as secret police. Families attempting to leave the city without authorization were intercepted at ports and border crossings. The consequences of attempted flight were collective. When one family tried to smuggle their 13-year-old daughter to relatives in Spain, they were apprehended at Ostia. The daughter was returned to palace service at triple the normal frequency. The father was forced to attend every session, standing in designated witness positions. The mother was compelled to prepare her daughter before each visit, bathing, dressing, speaking the required blessings while the younger siblings watched. The family's suffering became public spectacle, a walking deterrent to anyone else contemplating resistance. The Praetorian Guard elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor were deeply embedded in the system, which made resistance virtually impossible. Guards were rewarded with access to victims after imperial use, creating a tier of perpetrators with weapons and training. They rotated assignments throughout the palace, ensuring that every corridor, every chamber, Every entrance was monitored by men who had personal investment in the system's continuation. Some guards became specialists in particular forms of enforcement. There were those skilled in extracting compliance from resistant participants without leaving visible marks. Others specialized in transporting women through Rome's streets in covered litters to avoid public awareness of their movements. Still others managed the logistics of the mass ceremonies, coordinating dozens of participants with military precision. Cassius Chaerea, a decorated soldier, endured relentless humiliation by Caligula mocked, forced to dance in women's clothes, degraded daily. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula staged a grotesque festival of forced performances. The next day, Chaerea and fellow praetorians ambushed him, striking dozens of blows, one targeting his genitals, revenge for years of sexual terror. His family was murdered to erase his bloodline. Claudius erased Caligula's memory, but the trauma persisted. Survivors carried scars. Bureaucrats maintained records, and the system of cruelty quietly endured. Centuries later, archaeologists confirmed his methods. Caligula didn't invent violence, he industrialized it, making it systemic. The choice to protect oneself by sacrificing others, to normalize horror through laws and bureaucracy, didn't die with Caligula. Later, rulers inherited the precedent. Systems could legitimize anything if survival demanded it. Rome showed that civilization's machinery, laws, documents, administration could serve any agenda when compliance outweighed conscience. Centuries later, fragments of catalogued artifacts testified to real horrors, not chaotic madness, but systematic cruelty. Caligula didn't just abuse power, he built machines of fear and complicity, documented with care. Once such systems exist in memory, they cannot be destroyed, only rebuilt and rationalized by those who follow. The most chilling aspect of Caligula's legacy isn't what he did. It's that he proved it could be done systematically, legally, and with the cooperation of an entire elite class who told themselves they had no choice while their hands held pens, signing documents, and torches, illuminating horrors they pretended not to see.